Today is the National Day of Palestinian Women, and to celebrate this day, I wanted to honor some of the most important women in Palestinian history. While it's true that when we think about history and important figures, we often think about men only, women have also always had a very important role as well, and Palestine is no exception. While we often think about the face of the revolution as the bearded man in the militia or the young men throwing stones across the border in Gaza, women have also always fought alongside with them, and it is important that we honor these names and we know them because their stories are also very important, and that's exactly what I intend to do in this video. I am going to share the general role of Palestinian women throughout history, as well as talking about some specific women who have also been revolutionaries, fought against the occupation, had a very important presence in activism, and overall just been the backbone of a very endangered nation. All of this while also fighting for their rights as women, as well as fighting against gender inequality, both of which come from two main interrelated forces. On the one hand, we have the Israeli occupation, and on the other one, the patriarchal control in society. Women have for many decades now fought against these two main forces through activism, law, or civil rights movements. Palestinian women have been involved in the struggle since the very beginning. For example, in the 1920s, they used to fight alongside with the men against the British occupation. They would form organizations, organize protests, as well as express themselves politically more and more every single day. Nothing stopped these Palestinian women from fighting for their country, even when they had to go away to places like Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or other countries in the world. They continued to fight for Palestine. Like I mentioned before, one of the things that they would often do in the 1920s to fight against the British occupation was create organizations, one of which was the Federation of Women's Actions Committee, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. However, the first ever official union of women was in 1921, and it was to fight against the British occupation. Although it was heavily prohibited and meetings were not allowed, 300 women attended the first ever Congress of this union, the objectives of which were the expansion of the women's movement, the participation of women in the resistance, as well as the more social work and taking care of the wounded, the soldiers, and the children left behind. These meetings and congresses were held discreetly in their homes, where they would collect materials and money to buy weapons and clothing for the revolutionaries who were fighting against the British Empire, to then transport all of these materials with the help of animals to the mountains where the revolutionaries were, knowing that if they got caught by the British soldiers, they would get killed. But they wanted to help the revolutionaries in any way that they could. Now, going back in time a little bit, there was a notorious shift in the social order in 1844 when women first participated alongside men in protesting against the first Jewish settlements. Between the 1900s and 1910, as the region of Palestine was under the Ottoman rule, Arab women initiated the creation of numerous associations and societies. These organizations were formed mostly in the larger cities and especially in cities with large Christian populations such as Jaffa, Jerusalem, or Haifa. In 1917, they took part in large demonstrations at the time of the Balfour Declaration, and later formed a 14-member delegation that demanded that the Balfour Declaration be revoked and that the Jewish immigration to Palestine be halted. In 1921, Palestinian women organized by setting up their own society known as the Arab Women's Association, based in Jerusalem. The society organized demonstrations against the Jewish settlements in Palestine. In the 1929 Palestine riots, women took part in multiple protests and demonstrations which resulted in many women being killed by the British Mandate forces. They organized a women's conference where they sent out a protest letter to King George V and to the League of Nations. Now, moving forward in time, the Israeli occupation has obviously heavily affected women ever since it began, and not only those who were forced into exile in 1948, but also those who were expelled in 1967 with the Six-Day War, as well as every one of their descendants. If we look at the numbers, almost 80% of the entire Palestinian population are refugees, and carrying that with you marks you forever. And even the women who are not in Palestine anymore due to the occupation, like myself, still continue to fight for this country every single day. And it's because of the women of 1948 who made it their mission to make sure that their children and their family never forget where they came from, where they belong, and the right to return. It's because these women of 1948 and 1967 made it their responsibility to make sure that their children always knew the importance of being Palestinian and the importance of fighting for their country. They made sure that the next generation was even stronger than the one before, and it is thanks to them that we have the fighters that we do today. As if the occupation wasn't enough as it is, many measures taken by the Israel Defense Force, the IDF, have affected the Palestinian women's physical and psychological health to extreme degrees, as well as their education and economic security. In fact, a press release issued by the Ma'an news agency in 2007 reported that many women suffer from psychological and sexual violence at the Israeli checkpoints. These cases reported forced a strip search under the pretext of security measures, and many women have even had to give birth at these checkpoints because they were not allowed to go to a hospital and were detained at the checkpoints for hours instead. Like I'm sure most of you know, almost 1 million Palestinians were forced into exile back in 1948. These people, and specifically the women, had to endure being humiliated, tortured, and sometimes even raped by the Israeli soldiers. These women, who had to leave their houses with only what they could take in their hands and their children in their arms, sometimes being separated from their fathers or husbands, had to flee only, like I said, with what they have to an unknown destination. They were often expelled to places like the refugee camps on the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Syria, or Lebanon, to live in cane tents at first, then canvases, to later move to houses made out of blocks without water, electricity, or showers. With common toilets and a disastrous economy, they lived only on the aid that the UNRWA provided them. For those who don't know, the UNRWA is the United Nations Agency for Palestine refugees in the Middle East. Like I said, one of the many roles that the women took during and after the Nakba was to teach children about the resistance and to just never surrender in the face of difficulties. And they did all of this by forming organizations like the ones that I've previously talked about that would take all of these weapons and clothing to the revolutionaries in the mountains, but also to organize protests, demonstrations, participate in politics, and even in military action. Now, in the 1960s and following the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Movement, dedicated to regaining the lost homeland, some women like Leila Khaled, who I will be talking more about later on the video, decided to turn to more militant activities. Eventually, women also started to engage in formal politics, mainly through the membership of the main Palestinian political factions. Although Palestinians tend to be socially conservative and are anxious to shield women and girls from what they might consider to be dishonorable or non-traditional behavior, many women found a new kind of freedom through education and political mobilization. A largely nonviolent intifada or uprising began in 1987. Women, men, and children combined efforts to resist the 20-year occupation of their land, and they did so in innovative ways, like for example by establishing alternative educational facilities for children after all the schools were closed, creating an alternative economy based on home products, as well as engaging in large-scale protests. However, such activities ended in the year 2000 with the start of the Second Intifada. The resistance was no longer a shared effort involving all sectors of society. It was an armed confrontation. Women suffered greatly from rising levels of violence and decreasing security for civilians. No one felt safe, and girls traveling from their homes to schools or universities were likely to experience harassment at the Israeli army checkpoints. And as the economic situation got worse, women had fewer opportunities for employment. Now, obviously, with all of this, the number of Palestinians with serious mental illnesses rose, and with it, a large number of women exhibited signs of deep anxiety for the safety of their children. And that continues today. Every single mother in Palestine will tell you that they fear the second their kid leaves their house, especially in Gaza. The constant fear of not knowing if your child is ever going to come home, if they're going to get detained or just killed by the Israeli police or army or just a settler is immense. So before we move on to the names of the very important women in Palestinian history, I also wanted to touch on a very important subject, which is imprisonment and death, on two different ways. On one way, we have female prisoners, which I will be talking about in just a second, but also we just can't ignore the great suffering that a woman goes through when she's either handed the corpse of her son, her brother, her father or husband, or the news that they have been imprisoned, because more often than not, this imprisonment will come with torture and great suffering. It is sadly something that every Palestinian woman goes through, either personally or by knowing someone who does, but there's absolutely no Palestinian woman who hasn't in one way or another gone through it. And it's sad because this has been going on since the very beginning of the occupation, and while it adds to the strength of Palestinian women, it also adds so much to the suffering as well. I have an entire video dedicated to Palestinian prisoners. If you're interested in that topic, then you can watch that. But in regards to female prisoners by the Israeli government, since 1967, more than 17,000 women have been held in Israeli jails, including 36 women who are still in prison today and another 47 who are awaiting trial. The largest number of arrests occurred in the First Intifada from 1987 to 1993, during which 3,000 women were arrested, and in the second uprising of 2000 to 2005, when around 1,000 women were arrested. The arrest of women has also intensified over the past couple of years, especially in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The number of child prisoners in Israeli jails currently stands at 250, including 41 children from Jerusalem. The number of administrative prisoners is about 500, including men and women, while there are about 700 prisoners who are suffering from illnesses, including 30 cancer patients. In 2019, the Israeli occupation authorities arrested about 5,550 Palestinians, the majority from Jerusalem, including about 889 children and 128 women. Women prisoners suffer unbearable living conditions in Israeli prisons, deprived entirely of their basic human rights, including the right to privacy and the right to education. Moreover, during imprisonment, Palestinian women are often subjected to gendered violence, torture, and sexual harassment and assault in an attempt to break them. In the second part of this series, which will be posted on my Instagram, I will be talking about some specific women who are not only some of the most important women in Palestinian history, but also some of my own personal heroes. These women, who go from writers and painters to activists, judges, and lawyers, have made sure that the world knows that we will never give up the right to our land, our human rights, and the right to return. And this is why Palestinian Women Day is so important, because we need to acknowledge the force and power that comes when women stand together against injustice.